It was the scorching summer of 1974, and Muhammad Ali was traversing the landscape of Georgia as the most famous man on the planet. Only 3 months had passed since the rumble in the jungle, where he had shocked the world by reclaiming the heavyweight crown from George Foreman in Zaire. He was the undisputed king, a figure of immense power and charisma. Yet, as his black sedan cut through the thick, humid air of the Deep South, that global fame felt like a distant memory. The prestige of the championship belt meant little to the red clay and the stagnant heat of the back roads, where the past refused to stay buried. The interior of the car was heavy with the smell of sweat and leather. Ali sat behind the wheel, his large hands gripping the steering wheel with a relaxed but firm intensity. Beside him and in the back seat sat his inner circle: Howard Bingham, the ever-present photographer; Angelo Dundee, the tactical mind who had guided him through the toughest rounds of his career; and Drew Bundini Brown, the emotional heartbeat of the camp. They were driving from Atlanta toward a small town for a scheduled appearance, but the vast stretches of pine trees and dilapidated shacks made it feel as though they were traveling through a different century altogether. The fuel gauge was dipping dangerously low, and their stomachs had been growling for miles. The atmosphere was light until the car crested a small hill, and a lonely, weather-beaten structure appeared on the shoulder of the road. It was Miller's Diner, a low-slung building with peeling white paint and a rusted tin roof that shimmered under the unforgiving sun. A few pickup trucks were parked haphazardly on the gravel lot, kicking up clouds of orange dust. Ali began to slow the vehicle, scanning the windows for a sign of life, but his gaze suddenly locked onto a small, hand-painted piece of cardboard propped against the glass of the front door. The letters were crude and jagged, but the message was unmistakable: whites only, no colored trade. The car came to a jarring halt, the tires spitting gravel as Ali slammed on the brakes. For a long moment, the only sound was the ticking of the cooling engine. The silence in the cabin became suffocating. Howard Bingham leaned forward, his camera momentarily forgotten on his lap, while Angelo Dundee felt a cold knot of dread tighten in his chest. They knew exactly where they were. This was the territory where the Civil Rights Act was just a piece of paper, and the old hatreds were enforced by blood and silence. Bundini Brown began to whisper, his voice cracking with genuine fear, pleading with Ali to put the car back in gear and keep driving. He spoke of the clans that ruled these woods, and the local sheriffs who looked the other way when people like them disappeared on such roads. They argued that a ham sandwich wasn't worth their lives, reminding the champ that he was too important to the world to risk a confrontation in a nameless hole in the dirt. Ali did not respond to their frantic warnings. He didn't blink or turn his head. He simply stared at that sign with a jaw so tightly set it looked carved from granite. The playful, loquacious persona that the media loved had vanished, replaced by the terrifyingly focused warrior who had stood across from Liston and Frazier. He reached for the door handle, the metallic click sounding like the cocking of a hammer in the quiet car. Without a word of explanation or a glance back at his terrified friends, he stepped out into the blinding light and the swirling dust. He adjusted his shirt, smoothed out his posture, and began to stride toward the diner with the rhythmic, purposeful gait he used when walking toward the center of the ring for the opening bell. Every step he took was a deliberate challenge to the invisible lines drawn in the sand, his face a mask of unshakable resolve as he moved toward the door. Ali pushed the door open with a slow, deliberate force that sent a sharp, metallic chime ringing through the cramped interior of the diner. The sound acted like a guillotine blade, instantly severing the low hum of conversation and the clinking of silverware against heavy ceramic plates. Within the dim, wood-paneled room sat 15 local laborers, men with sun-scorched necks and hands calloused by decades of hard toil in the Georgia fields. They froze in mid-motion, some with forks suspended halfway to their mouths, their eyes widening as they processed the sight of the tall, broad-shouldered man standing in the threshold. The air was thick with the scent of burnt coffee, old grease, and a sudden, suffocating surge of hostility. Behind the long, scratched linoleum counter stood Earl Miller, a man whose skin looked like weathered upholstery and whose eyes held the cold, unwavering stare of a sentinel guarding a border. He wore a stained white apron that had long ago lost its original color, smeared with the grime of 1,000 shifts and the stubborn soot of the kitchen. Miller did not flinch or show the slightest hint of intimidation at the presence of the world's most famous athlete. In this small, isolated patch of the South, he was the ultimate authority, and the heavy championship belt Ali wore in the ring meant absolutely nothing against the unwritten laws of his establishment. The tension in the room became a physical weight, a suffocating pressure that made the seconds stretch into an eternity. Miller's jaw remained rigid as he watched Ali take a single step forward, his shadow stretching across the floorboards. Without breaking eye contact, the owner moved his right hand with a slow, calculated menace, sliding it beneath the edge of the counter, where the local legends said he kept a heavy hickory bat or a loaded sawed-off shotgun for exactly this type of intrusion. The customers remained motionless, their bodies tensed for the inevitable explosion of violence, their loyalty clearly siding with the man behind the grill. Miller's face remained a mask of stone-cold defiance, his presence radiating a deep-seated territorial aggression that surpassed any fear of physical combat. He stood his ground with the arrogance of a man who believed he was upholding a sacred tradition passed down through generations of his bloodline. The silence was finally broken not by a plea or an apology, but by a voice that rasped with the dry, jagged edge of a lifetime of prejudice. Miller spoke with a low, guttural growl that carried to every corner of the room, delivering a final warning that left no room for negotiation or compromise. He made it clear that the pavement outside was the only place Ali belonged, and that every moment the champion remained inside was a gamble with his own life. The words hung in the air like a thick fog, signaling that the rules of the world outside had no power here, and that Ali had finally stepped into a ring where the referee would never come to his aid. He stood in the center of the room, a lone figure of defiance, surrounded by a gallery of silent, judgmental witnesses who were waiting for the first drop of blood to hit the floor. Ali's teammates watched from the doorway, their breaths held, sensing that they were standing on the precipice of a disaster that could end the legend of the greatest before the sun had even begun to set over the Georgia pines. The atmosphere was a powder keg, and Miller's hand remained anchored under the counter, ready to strike the match that would burn the entire afternoon to the ground. Every eye in the diner was a weapon, every silence a threat, as the two men locked themselves into a psychological standoff that felt as ancient and brutal as the dirt road they had just traveled. Ali did not lunge forward with his fists clenched or respond to the blatant hostility with the physical aggression that Earl Miller and the men in the booths clearly expected from a heavyweight champion. Instead, he took a slow, measured step toward the stained linoleum counter and allowed a soft, genuine smile to spread across his face, a gesture so unexpected in the charged atmosphere of the diner that it visibly fractured Miller's defensive posture. This was not the reaction of a man who felt threatened or insulted, but the poise of someone who was in complete control of the space he occupied. The champion began to speak in a voice that was barely above a whisper, a calm and melodic tone that forced every man in the room to lean in slightly, straining to catch his words over the low hum of the refrigerator in the back. He did not shout or use the rhythmic bravado of his press conferences. He spoke with the quiet authority of a king visiting a forgotten province. He began to recount the names of the giants he had felled and the titles he had secured across the globe, not out of a need for vanity or to intimidate the man behind the grill, but to illustrate the staggering absurdity of the current moment. He painted a picture of stadiums filled with tens of thousands of people, screaming his name in Zaire, London, and New York, contrasting the immense weight of his global legacy with the small, fragile reality of a man standing in a dusty corner of Georgia. By laying out his achievements, Ali was highlighting the immense gulf between a man who had conquered the world and a man who chose to hide behind a jagged piece of cardboard taped to a window. The psychological shift in the room was palpable as the focus moved from the threat under the counter to the logic of the man standing in front of it. Ali leaned slightly over the bar, his eyes locking onto Miller's with an intensity that was devoid of malice, but filled with a profound, piercing curiosity. He posed a question that cut through decades of inherited prejudice, asking Miller to identify the source of the poison that resided in his heart. He sought to know exactly who had sat Miller down as a child and whispered the lies that had grown into this wall of silence and exclusion. The question was designed to strip away the bravado of the diner owner and force him to look at the foundations of his own belief system. Ali wanted to know how a man could harbor such a deep and reflexive loathing for a stranger he had never spoken to, a person whose life and character were mysteries to him. As he spoke, the restless shifting of boots on the floorboards ceased, and the aggressive grip Miller had on the object beneath the counter began to loosen ever so slightly. The champion was dismantling the environment, not with the power of his punch, but with the surgical precision of his insight, turning a confrontation into a moment of uncomfortable self-reflection for everyone present. He stood there, unmoving and unafraid, waiting for the echo of his words to sink into the conscience of the man who had spent his entire life being told that the color of a man's skin was more important than the content of his soul. The air in the diner remained heavy, but the nature of the weight had changed from the threat of a brawl to the crushing burden of a truth that no one in the room was prepared to answer. Ali remained perfectly still, his smile never wavering as he watched the gears of Miller's mind grind against the friction of a reality that didn't fit the script he had been given by his ancestors. Ali struck at the most sensitive part of the man's soul, targeting the deep-seated fear that sat behind his eyes like a cornered animal. He began to recount the story of his youth in Louisville, taking the room back to the rainy afternoon when his bicycle was stolen, and a young boy's rage threatened to consume him. He spoke of the white police officer named Joe Martin, who didn't arrest him or brush him off, but instead told him that if he wanted to fight, he had better learn how to do it right. Ali walked the listeners through the gym where that white man had planted the seeds of greatness in a black child, teaching him the discipline and the heart that would eventually conquer the world. By sharing this, Ali was dismantling the walls in the room, showing that the very foundation of his success was built on a bridge between races that Miller refused to acknowledge. He looked directly at the man behind the counter and spoke with a piercing clarity, explaining that Miller was not a villain or a monster of legend, but simply a man paralyzed by weakness. He characterized Miller as a prisoner of his own heritage, a man who lacked the courage to think for himself and instead chose to live as a hollow vessel for the bitter ghosts of his father and his grandfather. The champion's voice was steady as he accused the diner owner of letting dead men dictate his life, turning him into a guard for a crumbling fortress of hate. As Ali spoke, the atmosphere in the room began to shift in a way that was visible on the faces of the patrons in the booths. The men who had been ready to back Miller in a fight began to look down at their plates or stare out the window, their collective support evaporating as they realized the absurdity of their stance. The air of undisputed authority that Miller had worn like armor was disintegrating, leaving him standing there exposed and small in his own establishment. He looked around his own diner and saw that he was losing the silent consensus of his neighbors, his power slipping away, not through force, but through the sheer weight of the truth Ali was laying bare. To punctuate the moment and shatter the last remnants of the old order, Ali reached into his pocket and pulled out a crisp $20 bill, snapping it onto the scarred linoleum of the counter with a sound like a starting pistol. He made it clear that the money was an invitation for everyone present to break bread as equals, regardless of the color of their skin or the signs on the windows. He declared that the feast was starting immediately and that every person in the building, including those who had just arrived or those who were traditionally excluded, was his guest. The act of laying down the cash was the final blow to the segregationist policy of the establishment, transforming the diner from a site of exclusion into a stage for a shared human experience. Ali stood his ground, his hand still resting near the money, watching as Miller stared at the bill as if it were a foreign object from another dimension. The silence that followed was no longer the silence of a threat, but the heavy, expectant quiet of a world waiting to see if a man was capable of waking up from a lifelong dream of hatred. Miller's hand, which had been hidden for so long, finally began to creep out from under the counter, trembling slightly as it came into the light of the afternoon sun. The patrons remained motionless, caught between the gravity of their past and the undeniable magnetic pull of the champion's vision for the future. Every second that passed felt like an hour as the ghost of the Old South collided with the living reality of the man who called himself the greatest. Ali's smile remained fixed, his eyes never leaving Miller's, as he waited for the internal collapse of the wall that had stood for 3 generations in the middle of Georgia. Miller stood paralyzed in the center of the world he had built, a kingdom of linoleum and grease that suddenly felt like a cage. His entire reality was collapsing under the weight of the champion's gaze, the foundations of his inherited identity crumbling into dust. Ali posed the final question that acted as a spiritual knockout blow, forcing the man to choose between the safety of a cowardly tradition and the terrifying freedom of change. He asked Miller to envision the legacy he would leave behind for his grandchildren, challenging him to decide whether he wanted to be remembered as a small-minded man hiding behind a cardboard sign, or as a soul brave enough to evolve in the light of day. Miller's hands began to shake with a violent, uncontrollable tremors that rattled the very air around him, his fingers twitching as the grip of the past finally slipped. He moved with a heavy, mechanical slowness, emerging from behind the sanctuary of the counter for the first time in years, to face the men in the booths, not as their leader, but as a man seeking redemption. Every eye in the diner followed his shuffling footsteps as he crossed the worn floorboards toward the front door, the silence so profound that the creak of the wood sounded like a thunderclap. He reached the glass and stared at the crude, hand-painted letters of the sign that had defined his family for 3 generations, his breath hitching in his chest. With a sudden, desperate surge of movement, he reached up and tore the cardboard from the window, the sound of the adhesive ripping away echoing like a victory cry. He began to crush the sign in his calloused palms, twisting and mangling the words until they were nothing but a shapeless mass of pulp. He walked to the rusted metal trash bin in the corner and dropped the remains of his prejudice inside, letting it vanish into the darkness of the waste. It was the absolute moment of his surrender to a higher truth, a public execution of the hatred he had worn as a badge of honor. As he turned back to face Muhammad Ali and the room full of witnesses, thick, hot tears began to spill from his reddened eyes and track through the grime on his cheeks. They were not tears of physical pain or the sting of a punch, but the heavy water of a deep and sudden purification, washing away the layers of inherited bile that had poisoned his heart since childhood. He stood before the champion, exposed and raw, his chest heaving as the crushing pressure of being the guardian of hate finally lifted from his shoulders. The patrons in the diner watched in stunned disbelief as the man who had been the anchor of their local segregation buckled under the weight of his own humanity. The atmosphere of the room had shifted irrevocably, the old ghosts of the Georgia woods retreating into the shadows as the light of a new day flooded through the now clear glass of the front door. Miller looked at his own hands as if seeing them for the first time, no longer weapons of exclusion, but the tools of a man who had finally chosen to be whole. Ali remained perfectly still, a witness to the transformation, his presence serving as both the catalyst and the sanctuary for the man's sudden rebirth. The $20 bill remained on the counter, a silent contract for the new era that had just begun in a nameless diner on a dusty road, where the strongest man in the world had won a fight without ever lifting his hands from his sides. The silence that followed was no longer a weapon, but a shared space where the air felt lighter, cleaner, and filled with the possibility of a life that Miller had never dared to imagine for himself or his kin. The champion watched the tears fall, knowing that the hardest part of the battle was over, and that the man standing before him was no longer an enemy, but a person who had finally found the strength to lay down his arms in the face of an undeniable truth. Ali sat at the counter and ate his cheeseburger with a quiet, methodical grace that seemed to anchor the entire room in a new reality. The steam rose from the plate, and the smell of fried onions filled the space that only minutes before had been choked by the scent of a brewing riot. Outside, the news of the torn sign traveled through the dust like a wildfire, and slowly, tentatively, people began to cross the threshold who had never dared to step onto the gravel lot before. A young black couple entered, their eyes darting toward the champion and then toward the man behind the grill, finding only a somber, nodding acceptance where there used to be a snarl. Miller served everyone with an identical mechanical focus, his movements stripped of their old aggression and replaced by a heavy, humbling sense of duty. He poured coffee for hands of every color, his own hands still red from the effort of destroying his past. The clatter of plates and the murmur of integrated conversation became the new soundtrack of the establishment, drowning out the ghosts of the old Georgia. Years passed, and the seasons bled into one another, but the memory of that afternoon remained etched into the foundations of the building. Ali returned to that spot on the road whenever his travels brought him through the South, no longer as a challenger or a target, but as a cherished friend who had performed a surgery on a man's soul. He watched as the diner flourished, growing from a dilapidated shack into a beacon of the community that people whispered about with reverence. The faded paint was replaced by bright, welcoming colors, and the staff behind the counter became a mosaic of the town itself, with young men and women of different backgrounds working side by side in the heat of the kitchen. Miller grew old, with a lightness in his step that he had never possessed in his youth, his face softening into a map of wrinkles earned through laughter and service, rather than scowls and spit. The final image of this bond appeared in the form of a weathered envelope delivered to Ali's doorstep long after the champion's own body had begun to slow down. It was a letter written by an elderly Miller in the final weeks of his life, his handwriting shaky, but his message crystal clear. He confessed in those pages that the afternoon in 1974 was the moment his real life had actually begun, describing that simple meal as the most significant order he had ever filled in his half-century of work. He thanked the champion for having the mercy to use words instead of fists, acknowledging that Ali had saved him from a deathbed filled with nothing but the cold, dry ash of a wasted hatred. The letter spoke of children and grandchildren who grew up knowing a man of character instead of a man of prejudice, ensuring that the cycle of inherited bile had finally been broken for good. Ali had walked into a fortress of the old world and dismantled it brick by brick, using nothing but the terrifying power of the truth and a $20 bill. He had secured a victory more permanent and more profound than any knockout recorded in a ring, proving that the greatest strength lay in the patience to wait for a hardened heart to finally thaw. As the sun set over the memory of the Georgia Road, the legacy of that day remained not in a trophy or a belt, but in the open door of a diner where everyone was welcome to sit at the table.